Welcome back to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. Jeff, it is a pleasure to have you on the show. Would you mind introducing yourself to everyone out there listening?
My name is Jeff Moriarty. I'm a professor of philosophy and also executive director of the Hoffman Center for Business Ethics at Bentley University, which is in Waltham, Massachusetts, just outside Boston.
Could you explain to me a little bit about what business ethics is? And then we can get into kind of the subject that I found where you kind of talk about the selling of psychic services, which I think is a important discussion to be had.
So business ethics is a big field. There's a lot of different parts to the field. But we might, when we talk about business ethics, we think about what business is, and business is at least a couple of different things. One is an activity. It's the activity of buying and selling. And so we can talk about ethical issues that attend the buying of goods, consumer ethics, the selling of goods, maybe sales ethics that might involve considerations of information disclosure and persuasion. We can also talk about how the goods and services that are bought and sold are also produced, and how they're marketed, how they're distributed, and who makes those decisions. So that's one way of thinking about business ethics is to think about buying and selling and the ethics that attend that activity. And we can also think about business as a thing. So Walmart is a business. Universities in some sense are a business where I work. The corner drugstore where you got coffee this morning is a business as well. And so we can think about ethics internal to business as a thing. So how does business treat its employees? How does a business treat its suppliers? What are a business's responsibility for ethical issues that arise in a supply chain in the business? So business as an activity, business as a thing, the ethical issues that attend those two kind of domains. That's how I think of business ethics.
Could you maybe give me an example of like a good business ethic? Like if you're selling a service to a consumer, what would be a good proper protocol to follow good business ethic guidelines? And then maybe you can give me a negative as well too.
I think actually we think more in terms of the negative than the positive, though maybe that's a mistake in the field. But people, but it also might reflect a kind of moral reality. So one of the things that I tend to think is true, and I think a lot of people tend to think is true, that there's a lot of ways of doing permissible things. There's a kind of a big group of actions which are permissible, and though they're different. And then there are going to be certain actions that are wrong. So you need to stay away from those. But then there's like a bunch of ways that you can live your life and conduct yourself as a business person that are permissible and right in that way. So things that would be wrong would include lying to consumers if you're a business, lying to them, deceiving them without lying. Would be another way of engaging in wrongful behavior in a business setting, or taking advantage of consumers' ignorance. So if you know that a consumer has a false belief about your product that's material, that's relevant to their interest in the product, and you make the sale on that basis, then you've done something wrong. So oftentimes we'll require businesses to disclose information at the end of advertisements, just to make sure that nobody's acting on false pretenses. So that would be an example of a bad business practice. Those would be, lying, deceiving without lying, taking advantage of ignorance. Examples of good business practices are, the opposite. So disclosing information, trying to understand what a consumer needs and wants, and trying to respond to those needs in a truthful fashion.
Now, when you mentioned the negative kind of focus, especially in this area, is that just because it's what happens when money gets involved? I mean, there's a lot of stuff that ends up getting tossed out when we talk about what's ethically right to do something. A lot of people, money corrupts a lot of people, but that's kind of like the point of a business is to make money. It's not necessarily caring so much about the consumer. You do want to make a product for the consumer, but a lot of the times it's also about making a profit.
Yeah, and without profit, businesses can't survive. So any business ethic that tells you that somehow profits are wrong, or that companies shouldn't make profits, is totally unrealistic. And by the way, just false. Because businesses, if they are public companies, they have responsibilities to their shareholders too. And that's usually to make some profit. Maybe it's not maximum profit, but it's some profit. If you or I invest in a business, we typically do so with the idea that we're going to make some positive return on our investment. That's why we do it. Promises have been made, representations have been made to us, and so therefore there's an obligation to try to follow through on those representations, if not promises. I think why people focus on what's bad in the business world is that that's what gets the attention. So every so often people will turn to the business ethics community and say, what do you think about this? And it's almost always some big corporate scandal. So it's Enron or it's WorldCom. And these are
Or it's
actually not
Walmart.
sure. So some issues that arise in the supply chain or how Walmart treats its employees, these things come up. That seems to be what gets attention. Now, along the way, Walmart is doing some interesting things, of course, for its consumers. They're providing necessary products at a low price, and that's a valuable service to the communities in which they operate. I mean, there's some negative externalities as well when it comes to competition with other sellers of goods. So that's another conversation as well. But I think the reason people focus on the negative is because that's what gets the media attention, and so there's a natural focus on that. But I think it's also the case that there's a lot of ways to act that are right, that are permissible. And, companies that give a lot to charity, that's one way to kind of live in the world. And the companies that give just a little bit to charity, that's another way to live in the world. And I'm not sure that one is, impermissible and the other is permissible, the only way to live. And that's true for individuals as well. Some give a lot to charity, some give just a little bit, and maybe both of those things are fine, though one might be more praiseworthy than another. But the person who steals from a charity, that person is doing something wrong, and so we can kind of say that with more decisiveness.
How does it affect when it comes to a small corporation compared to a large corporation? If you're talking about one of the big monolith chains, it seems like it's always trending in the newspaper of doing some horrible act or something like that, compared to a smaller business that is maybe more locally known, compared to, I guess, the ethical actions. Which one do you see the most, I guess, focused towards the negative, or which one is doing the most negative?
I'm not sure I have a good answer to that question, just because it's an empirical question, and I don't have access to or know about any of the facts that would help me to pronounce on that. I do think people focus more on the large corporations because they are kind of more well known, at least nationally. They have a bigger profile, but they have a lot more money and resources and power, and this opens up opportunities for them to have a big impact, either positively or negatively, and that might catch our attention. So a small corporation, like the one my parents, my in-laws run, is they're not going to be able to lobby well-connected politicians for tax breaks or special incentives or lenient treatment. They're not also going to be able to give millions of dollars to charity, or not. They're existing on the margins. They're doing well and providing a service, but they're not such a big player that they can make a massive impact on the world, whether it's for good or ill. But a corporation like Walmart, a corporation like Apple, has the potential, because of their power and their money, and these are connected, to do something either really good or really bad for the world. When they say things like, I'm not sure I like the regulation in this part of the world, regulators take notice, politicians take notice. If Tim Cook wanted to pass along word to the legislature that he thinks things to be done a certain way, the legislature will pay attention to that, whereas they won't pay attention to the small corporation. Also, large corporations just have a lot more money, so they're able to donate a lot more to charity, or not, as they choose. So it's really about power and money, I think, is not large and small. And this goes for large and small, not large and small, people, but rather people with a lot of money versus people with not a lot of money. The same kinds of disparities arise.
The reason I asked that was I was trying to craft a baseline here, because focusing more into like the selling of psychic services, all I'm seeing is independent people, or I'm seeing just one person that sends a message who's maybe under like a fake Instagram picture with like an egg as a profile picture or something. Like it's just they're either trying to scam you, or there might be some people that actually have these beliefs into this area where I don't see any giant corporations. So I'm wondering how the ethics change and how you had to analyze it to write your paper when you're looking at the selling of psychic services.
So when people think about large corporations versus small corporations, different kinds of issues arise. There might be issues of scale and scope, but at the core, there's still a business operation. There's still the buying and selling of services. So, that's, if business is at its core an activity. Again, business can be a thing. It can be Walmart. It can be the corner drugstore. But a business can be an activity. Business is buying and selling. And so large corporations, the Walmarts and Targets of the world engage in business, as do small operations, a small local pet store, or a place where you get your coffee in the morning. So or the psychic. So these are all they're all engaging in business as an activity, and so the same kinds of issues arise. Again, for the large corporation, we can talk about corporate social responsibility or corporate political activity. That's not going to happen with the psychic, but they're engaging in this activity that we call business, the buying and selling of goods. And so therefore, ethical issues are going to arise. They're going to attend that transaction that is at the core of business. So it's not the case. The psychic, we might say, well, we're not going to worry about their political influence, or we're not going to worry about what their supply chain, as we might with Apple or Walmart. We're not going to worry about whether or not they're giving money to charities in developing countries, but they're still engaging in business as an activity, and so ethical issues do attend that.
When it comes to looking into the psychic abilities and the ethics of selling psychic services, how do you even get started looking into something like that?
So what I'm interested in is one of the things I'm interested in is what are markets for? What good comes out of markets? Why do we have these things? So why is it the case, when people buy and sell all the time? You've probably already engaged in many buying and selling transactions today, as a member of a business, as a consumer, as a third party. The economy turns, the world economy turns because of transactions, because of buying and selling. And I'm interested to think about what value comes from those transactions, from buying and selling. And the way I think about it is to think about what sorts of things do we want to be able to be sold in markets, and what sorts of things do we not want to be able to be sold in markets. And I think that by thinking about the distinction between these things, we can discover something interesting. I'm not saying I have, but we can begin to think about what's interesting and valuable about having markets at all. So things that we typically don't want to be bought and sold are things like body parts, kidneys, in theory, right? And in practice, people do sell kidneys and other body parts, but in most countries, this is illegal, and most people think it is wrong, ethically wrong. Sex is typically not something that we allow to be sold in markets. Surrogacy services, obviously services like the services of a hitman or contract killer, we wouldn't want that to be bought and sold either. But lots of things are sold in markets as well. The microphones that we're speaking into, the computers that we're using to have this conversation, the clothes that we're wearing, the coffee that we drink, the pet food that we buy our dogs, all these things are bought and sold in markets. So a lot of things are bought and sold in markets. Some things aren't. And by thinking about cases at the margins and why that should either be sold or not sold in markets, I think we can discover something valuable, what markets are for in general. That's how I got into it. It's kind of like a test case for what can and can't be sold in the market.
Do you believe people should be selling psychic services? And have you seen it done ethically right at all?
So the view that I come to in the paper that I write is that it should be permissible legally, and I think it's permissible morally in many circumstances for people to sell psychic services. So I think this should be allowed to happen in general, and it can be done ethically. Though I think a lot of money spent on psychic services is money wasted, because I think people are not getting what they think they're getting, which is new knowledge produced by the exercise of psychic abilities.
Now, when we talk about new knowledge, could you maybe define that a little bit more? Because I think with psychic services, it's sometimes just the overall feeling that some people say that they get from it, like a feeling of relief, whether it was that they got to contact someone who might be dead or something like that. Not saying there's any scientific evidence to prove that there was any of that at all. It could be all just huckster stuff. But to them, they felt something, which is, I mean, it's like a grief counselor in a sense too, just less scientific, more somebody who's doing independently through maybe I don't know, not saying they got a degree, but just this authorization certificate they got online for like a month, a course or something like that.
Yeah, there's a lot of things to think about in there, and I think you're asking all the right questions. So one thing I would say is it's an empirical question, whether people in general come out of psychics feeling better or come out of psychics feeling worse. And I suspect that psychics want people to come out feeling better so that they will have more return business. But it's an empirical question, and I don't have the data. I don't think the data exists to understand whether it's on positive, it produces good feelings or bad feelings in people. Though I know that psychics have an incentive to make people feel good. But I think I would say two other things. One is that I think insofar as it produces good feelings at all, it's because people have an underlying belief that the psychics are indeed producing new knowledge for them. So for example, take necromancers. Necromancers are people who claim to be able to speak to the dead. So I have a dog, and the pet store that I go to, they have on occasion advertised the services of a pet necromancer.
Are you serious? Wait, are you serious?
Yes,
That's crazy. I've never heard of that.
yes. So I took a picture of the flyer. I should share. I should share it with you. It's a bit wrinkled, but I do have the picture of the flyer. And so they'll speak to your dead pet and let you know how their pet is doing. And so I think insofar as I felt good coming out of a conversation with that pet necromancer, I think it's because underlying that feeling is a belief that they're actually telling me how my dog is doing on the other side, and not just causing me to feel good. So I think the feel good, insofar as I do feel good at all, is because of this belief that I have. And I think the final thing I would say is that just because you feel good after a transaction does not make the transaction legitimate and or something that we should accept morally, that we think is okay. And I think we can see this by thinking about cases where people do feel good after a transaction, but we would all agree that the transaction is illegitimate. So suppose somebody said, I'm collecting money for UNICEF. I'm collecting money for a charity that operates in developing countries that cures people of blindness or helps prevent malaria. And the minimum donation is $20 or $10. And so I give $10 thinking that it's going to help people in developing countries. Meanwhile, the person collecting is simply pocketing the money and spending it on trinkets for themselves. I might feel good after that transaction, but I think nobody would say that because I feel good, the transaction is somehow legitimate or ethically okay. I think all of us would say it's ethically not okay. It's an illegitimate transaction. It's not something that should happen. And that's because it's based on a false belief. I'm being defrauded in effect of my money. My money is going to something that I did not agree with. I did not agree to give my money to this person to spend on trinkets. I thought I was giving it to people in developing countries. And even if I feel good afterwards, and I might feel good afterwards, and I might never find out that this person is doing that, but that doesn't make it okay. It's not okay because it's based on this kind of misrepresentation or fraud. And I think something like that is going on in the case of psychics. I think many of these psychics are well-meaning. I think they genuinely believe that they have psychic powers and that they are producing new knowledge for people using their psychic abilities. But our best evidence indicates, and by the way, psychics themselves, they are a kind of a loosely self-policing group. So there are psychics who think that there are other people who say they're psychics who are not psychics. And it's very important to the community that those people not be allowed to operate because they are making it worse for the real psychics. So I think that all psychics are mistaken about their abilities, that they do not have the abilities they think they have, though I think many of their beliefs are genuine and they really do think they have the abilities they say they have. And I'm sure many of their consumers think that as well. However, I believe it is based on a false belief about the existence of psychic powers.
Just a little kind of personal anecdote, but just to lead into a bigger question here. I'm on a little bit different of a stance when it comes to psychic abilities. I just can't, I don't know what they're doing. That there's some things that I've been explained to that have just been unexplainable where I don't know how. Maybe something happened at a point, they got information from me. I have no clue. But if someone really believes it, like 100% that they have the psychic power, what's the ethics for trying to determine if they should start a business or not? Because then doesn't that affect kind of the whole purpose of the American dream of being able to start your own business if you want to start a business? Like now I'm ethically concerned of like, I don't want someone getting duped and losing all their money. And I know there's a lot of scammers out there, but at the same time, am I not being a like kind of jerk if I tell them that they don't have psychic powers or something like that? So then I'm stuck in this kind of like where I want to be ethically good in the moral sense of not shaming anybody's dream and stopping them from having a business, but at the same time protecting people, which I have a large concern for because there are a lot of people I've heard horror stories about lose thousands upon thousands of dollars. And that's even on the other side of that. People say, how could you be so dumb to lose thousands of dollars? Well, when you're in a state like a lot of people are, when they do lose that much money, it's really because someone just died in their family or they're at a really low point and they're looking for anything. And that is that little sliver of hope. But I don't know if that would qualify as being a business, even though you are technically selling a product and someone is receiving something, whether it's a feeling or something. It necessarily might just be it can get the same thing out of talking. You know, it's not necessarily there's talk therapy for a reason. Just having a good conversation with someone could spark them up. So I gave you a lot there, but
Well, let me see if I can engage with a few pieces of that. Again, I think you're raising lots of important issues. One is this idea of stomping on someone's dream to start a business. So I think the sale of psych services is definitely a business. It's a kind of business activity, which is the buying and selling of goods. I think that's the kind of the essence of business. If there's I distinguish two kinds of business, business as an activity, business as a thing. Maybe the essential bit of business is this activity of buying and selling. And so if someone's selling psychic services, they're clearly engaging in a business activity. But we don't think, even if it's somebody's dream to provide a service or sell a product to consumers, that they should be allowed to do it. There's a lot of things that we think that, somebody's dream might be to be a hitman or to be a pimp. And these are just simply not ethically acceptable professions. It might seem very rude to compare psychics to these individuals. And I don't mean to. My point is simply that there are certain things we don't allow people to buy and sell. And even if your dream is to do those things, that's not an acceptable dream. That's not a dream that we should allow you to realize and practice. To the point about psychics as psychism or the sale of psychic services as a kind of the sale of therapy, I think there's a lot to that, and I do think that what people might feel comfort, a kind of emotional relief from visiting psychics and going through these processes. Again, it's an empirical question of do more people feel better or worse afterwards? But maybe even if you, but I understand why people would do it. But I would say I think in part they feel relief because they think there is something genuine on the other side, that they are providing real knowledge. Somebody may have lost a loved one, a parent, a child. Maybe they didn't get to say something to them, and they feel the necromancer, the person who can speak to the dead, can do this for them. And they might feel relief after this session with the person. But I think that's only insofar as they think it's true that the person is able to communicate some message to the dead person. If they felt that they couldn't, then they would not feel a sense of relief afterwards. So and again, it's not necessarily that the necromancer is lying in the sense of deliberately telling the client a falsehood. They might, but nevertheless, I think they are telling the consumer a falsehood. They are deceiving them, I would say, in maybe by way of misleading them. So often in philosophy, we'll distinguish between, or in business ethics, we'll distinguish between lying to someone, which is telling them something false intentionally with the goal of getting them to have a false belief. But then also, then we distinguish that from misleading somebody, which is telling someone something false that causes them to have a false belief, but doing so unintentionally. So if you and misleading is still, there's something problematic about it, but we might not blame someone for it. And so I'm not in the business of blaming many psychics for for what they do. But if you can imagine, let's say you want to meet up with some friends at a bar, or a friend of yours wants to know, hey, Robbie, where are the rest of the friends? And you say, well, the friends are at the Oak Leaf, this bar. And you say that, but you know it's true. You're just trying to pull this guy's leg. You want to send him to the wrong bar. Then you're lying to them. You tell this person that they're at a bar, a certain bar. That's false, and you know it, and it causes the person to believe that and then go to the bar and he's alone. Whereas suppose now you are genuinely trying to direct your friend to where the rest of your friends are, and you say, well, they're at the Oak Leaf. We'll use the same example. But you genuinely think all your friends are there, and you're trying to direct this other friend to that group, but you are mistaken, right? So you have a false belief. It's through no fault of your own. You simply believe all your friends are there when really they're not. Now your friend goes to that bar, and again, your friend is alone. You're misleading your friend. You're not lying to your friend. You're not intentionally trying to get him to have a false belief, but you cause him to have a false belief. And that's bad for your friend, but we don't blame you for it. And I think that's the position in which we find a lot of psychics. I think they genuinely believe they have these powers, but I think our best evidence indicates that they don't. And so they're misleading as opposed to lying to people. They're not blameworthy, perhaps. We can disagree about that, I think,
No,
but
I
there's
think you're right. I think
something
you're right.
problematic with what they're doing.
I think you're right on that. I just think like would a classification of it calling it entertainment be something different if they're going to be a business?
If it's entertainment, if it's sold as entertainment, I think it's fine. Um, but the entertainment can't be based on, well, excuse me. So in the end, I think that people should be allowed to do this. Um, but it's I think a lot of the sale of psychic services is harmful. I think it's a harm we need to live with as a society for a variety of reasons. But I think if it's sold simply as entertainment and not like, and by the way, I'm speaking to dead people and can relay messages on your behalf, then I think there's no problem. Or I'm just turning over tarot cards, but I'm not pretending that they actually mean anything. Or I'm reading a star chart, but this has no relationship to anything that's going to happen in your life. You can just see how it happens, and what our process is. But I'm not pretending that it provides you new knowledge about your future or about your past or your current circumstances. Then I think there's no problem at all. But ultimately, my view is a lot of the sale of psychic services is problematic. It's harmful. I think people are not getting what they think they're getting, but we should allow it. In part because it's probably, yes, there are examples, as you point out, where people can lose hundreds or thousands of dollars, and probably more than we even know about, because people, I think, are embarrassed when they do lose lots of money to psychics because they think, you know what, this was stupid. I shouldn't have done this. And they're too embarrassed to report it to the authorities. But I also think that there is an analogy here with religious practice that should be taken seriously. I do think that for some people, belief in psychic abilities, either aura reading, numerology, astrology, cartomancy, various kinds of card reading, necromancy. For many people, well, I should say this is an empirical question too, and I don't have the data to support it one way or the other. Though I suspect that for many people, belief in these powers is analogous to a religious belief. And when it comes to the sale of religious products and services, the government rightly takes a fairly light touch. It doesn't ask for evidence that evil eye amulets, for example, do ward off evil spirits before they can be sold as warding off evil spirits. And I think that for some people, the purchase of psychic services is like that. It's a participation in a quasi-religious or religious way of life, as opposed to simple buying of a service that they think will produce some effect.
Well, I would agree with you on the religion and the psychic thing because I think it's one of those areas that it falls into, the psychic ability stuff or the psychic selling of psychic services. Because do we consider the church a business? I mean, a lot of people do. I'm atheist, so I consider the church kind of like a business. I can't believe it. I don't think there's any really scientific proof of it, but a lot of people do. And there's like this area where we just don't talk about it, or there's never a conclusion on it. So that's interesting you brought up at the government aspect of things. But what do you do when it comes to like, I mean, real serious ethical concerns, which I'm actually largely focused in, and actually I think it's really important to talk about when it comes to how do we set regulations in the United States, or in this, just if we focus on this, a culture that has a lot of religious people in it, but necessarily isn't 100% as much as it was maybe in like the 70s and the 60s. There's a lot more people that are more scientific based and really choose not to either go to a church or just choose to worship at home or just don't have a religion at all, compared to if we examine another country where there's people selling fortunes on the side of the street or something. There's a different impact there. But when we talk about the United States, what's some policy recommendations, at least to where we can talk about some serious ethical lines and concerns and real clear, definitive things of like, we're separating you from this actual business that is, pays taxes and does all this type of stuff.
Well, I mean, psychics, if they're operating a business, ought to be paying taxes. I do believe that. So, just as a way of background about the sale of psychic services, in some in the paper, I can't remember exactly which states do what, but some states have a ban on the sale of psychic services. That's not to say they enforce it regularly or with a lot of resources. So in some states, it's illegal to sell psychic services, and then you will still see that. I'm looking at some of my notes here.
I got you.
You will still
I bet it's like Oregon or something like that, where it's okay to sell psychic services.
California, it's okay. Oregon, I'm not sure exactly what. So New York, Pennsylvania, and Oklahoma, the sale of psychic services is prohibited. Let's see, in states like Louisiana, Mississippi, the sale is jurisdiction by jurisdiction. Actually, it will come as a shock to many of your listeners, but in New Orleans itself, the sale of psychic services is prohibited by New Orleans. I
Really?
think of that as like the voodoo capital of the world, but
Yeah, yeah,
sale of psychic
yeah.
services is prohibited. But look, enforcement is lax or non-existent. And then in other states, Michigan and California are examples. You can sell psychic services, but you need a license. And you think, well, how does one get a license to sell psychic services? Normally, to get a license to do something, you have to prove that you're competent at doing it. But I think in the case of Michigan and California, you simply need to pay money to the state to get a license. I think that the idea is that just generally tamps down the number of psychics in existence. So different states regulate this in different ways. So some states say, no, this is illegal. It's typically psychic services are grouped under the heading of fortune telling. All psychic services, even if they don't literally tell fortunes. Like necromancy, I think, is not telling a fortune, it's communicating with the dead, but that's grouped under fortune telling. So fortune telling is illegal in some states. In some states, it's permitted. In some states in which it's permitted, you need a license. And in other states, it's just kind of a laissez-faire.
Wait,
So,
how do we have Reiki energy healing then? Because I don't believe in that. I think there's no scientific evidence on that. But a lot of people have businesses and, they sell crystal skulls or they sell crystals and they sell all that. I think that's a giant just money scam. But a large part of our culture, especially my generation, is particularly interested in that area of like rubbing your hands over somebody.
yeah,
And I'm
energy
like,
healing.
yeah, but I don't know. There's no way I'm getting down with that.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
So that's a whole nother topic. So when I originally began thinking about this subject, I wanted to think about products and services that we have good reason to believe don't work, and say one example is psychic services of various kinds, and another is different kinds of medicines and medical services and products that we have good reason to think don't work. But I came to think that these need to be treated in different papers. So I actually have more research on the sale of medicines and medical services that don't work. So Reiki energy healing is not a psychic service. However, it is a medical service that we have good reason to believe, like aura reading and necromancy, doesn't do what it claims to be able to do. Now, according to the U.S., we regulate medical devices and products and services and drugs through the FDA. And before a product can be sold, it needs to be declared safe and effective. So Reiki energy healing is probably perfectly safe because it in all likelihood does nothing. I think I might get myself in trouble with some listeners in saying that, but there's no evidence that it does anything. I think I can say that very safely. However, is it effective? And there, the answer is probably no. No doubt, practitioners and consumers believe it is, and I believe their beliefs are genuine. And I want to be respectful of that. However, I think there's good reason to believe that they are wrong about its effectiveness. So I tend to think that the government should probably clamp down harder on medical beliefs, medical devices, products, services, and drugs that we have good reason to believe are ineffective. Homeopathy might be one example, but there's lots of things, naturopathy, various kinds of herbal remedies, not all.
Throw in acupuncture. I don't think that does a damn thing.
There is my understanding, I'm not an expert in acupuncture. My understanding is that the double-blind trials of acupuncture have not shown effectiveness. However, acupuncture is one of those things that has been around for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and it may have the status of a kind of religious or quasi-religious practice. So when people get acupuncture, it might not be the same as taking a pill like ibuprofen to cure a headache. It might be some kind of participation in a way of life. But I think you're right to say that there's a lot of stuff that's sold that's alleged to have medical properties, which does not in fact have medical properties. And at a minimum, I think regulators should require sellers of these products to be much more upfront about the lack of scientific evidence for the effectiveness of their products. That I think is the very minimum that should be done when it comes to Reiki, energy healing, naturopathy, energy healing of various kinds, homeopathy, and the rest. And I think some of these, I mean, disclosures don't work very well. You can like print on a package, this is not likely to work, and people will still buy it thinking that it works. So more drastic measures may need to be taken. But these are related subjects to psychic powers, but they are importantly different and
Yeah.
require separate treatment.
Well, I feel like the answer to this is probably going to be a good sum up for both of them. But when it comes to bigger restrictions and regulations, when it comes to a government standpoint or influence, when they have to seriously go through a lot of schooling and training to be able to get a certificate to be able to, do you think that would wean out a lot of people that are just maybe doing it for scamming purposes? Like, is there a way to put it to a point where you have to pay for an operator's license, you have to get it renewed, just like how we have regulations with the FDA. There's a long process that goes through until something is finally approved. I think it would wean out a lot of the scammers and, hucksters and all that, but we would consider it ethical? Like, would we consider it an actual reputable business? Because to me, if someone goes through all that processes that has been established legislative wise, of this is how you have to do to become a business owner or any of this, then I consider it like, okay, that's a business then, because they went through the steps, they jumped through the hoops to get that. But they didn't change. They're doing the same thing they were doing before those regulations would even be established. They just went through a bunch of extra hoops and probably paid however much money to get the processes done.
I think we definitely have businesses without any regulation, before any state was founded, before any regulatory
IHOP.
apparatus.
There's their
Right.
regulation on IHOP.
I do love pancakes. But before any state was founded, before any regulatory apparatus was instituted, people were engaging in business transactions. They were buying and selling, they were creating and consuming. So we don't want to think the state is somehow necessary for a business. But if the state isn't engaged in licensing, which it is in some cases, then it does, I think, give the veneer of respectability. I mean, I tend to think that if you have a lot of professions in society are self-regulating. So, lawyers and doctors are kind of they tell the government, in effect, we're going to do this ourselves. We're going to have, to be a doctor, you need to go to medical school and we approve of what's taught there. And you got you've got to pass these exams, and we approve what's in the exams, and this generally works well, and lawyers are the same. So the societies are self-regulating for the most part. I mean, they can be sued and so forth, and so the government has some involvement there with lawsuits and judges and juries and all the rest. But doctors are mostly a self-regulating business. And so if you thought the psychics can operate in the same way, I mean, the psychics are kind of all in on this. They all believe it. And again, I think for the most part, their beliefs are genuine. They psychics are worried about fake psychics, but from my perspective, none of it seems very well founded. So I don't know how to separate the wheat from the chaff on that. But I don't think so.
I think you would tackle it with a very reasonable approach. And it's what I agree with. I think we agree with probably more than we disagree with. I'm just trying to figure out like what qualifies because it's so much a part of our culture that I don't see it really ever. Like I do believe like you believe that they should have the services out there. There's just not like a whole, I don't believe in the whole selling it aspect of it. I don't believe because I think people take advantage of other people, but it's so much a part of our culture, much like religion is that I do not see it not having, I mean, were you shocked to see that there's a lot of people that are paying for these services and wanting these services? I mean, everyone has that belief in something mysterious or supernatural or something of that sort. And I just don't see it like even with regulations, with standards, with defining it and just telling people it doesn't exist, you don't have this. It's never going to go away. That's why it's so surprising to me that the actual communities of the psychic people or the business people, they regulate each other, like you mentioned. I mean, I wouldn't think that ever. I think everyone would be just trying to get a quick buck out of somebody, but it's like these people are actually, some people take it to the extreme where they'll go after people and like try and ruin their lives on the basis of them selling fake psychic services.
Yeah, and this is a really interesting issue. So um, sometimes fake psychics will be prosecuted by the government for fraud. This typically only happens when there's huge numbers of the money that's been extracted from the client or consumer is huge, and when the psychic can be demonstrated to have willfully lied to the consumer or the client, when the psychic sort of confesses, in fact, that they don't have psychic ability. So there's a case that happened in Florida. That where a young medical student actually was bilked out of about $500,000 by a psychic. The psychic said, there's a curse placed on your family, but I can lift the curse. You've got to give me a lot of money to engage in various spiritual mediations. I've got to buy a bunch of equipment, crystals, and all the rest. Eventually, the student was having no more money, went to the authorities and said, this is the situation. I'm sure she was extremely embarrassed. But the precipitating event that caused her to go to the authorities was the psychic told her, actually, I was just kidding. I am not a psychic. I don't have psychic powers. I was just screwing with you, basically. So that is the thing that all people want to avoid. But the question is, what makes it different from the pet necromancer at my local pet store that says, give me $20 and I'll give you a reading? You might think, well, that's just small dollars.
You need to change pet stores. I don't know why they're doing that.
Yes. Maybe I should wonder about the rest of the stuff that they're selling, but it seems to be, in bags stamped with a label that I'm familiar with. So the question that we need to ask ourselves, I suppose, is can the government distinguish one thing from the other? I think one of the ways to distinguish it is by saying, is the psychic confessing to lying? In that case, we need to avoid that. But I'm not sure that you have a way to tell that up front. And I don't think any licensing procedure is going to help. My sense is that a lot of psychics, it's small dollars. It's something that's affordable. Basic human decency should cause individuals not to exploit others down to their last dollar. but presumably this happens, and maybe this happens more in the world of psychic operators than it does in the world of, sellers of coffee or sellers of dry goods or textiles, just to pick kind of random examples. But maybe it doesn't. I mean, the question is, how is there a way to distinguish ex ante before we allow the industry to operate? What is likely going to happen? Is it going to be mostly people scamming people, or is it going to be all people scamming other people? Is it going to be just a tiny handful of people who are scamming? And by that, I mean deliberately lying. Or is it going to be mostly people who genuinely believe they have these powers, who provide a valuable service at a small dollars that people can afford, that are not exploiting them or trying to wring every last dollar out of them, for reasons having to do, based on clear lies and not just false statements that are misleading. My view on that is, I think the industry should be allowed to operate. I think we're going to see some of these bad actors, even though I think a lot of the industry is just, all the industry is based on false ideas about psychic abilities. I think we should let it operate, even though some people are going to be scammed in the end. I think that's a price that we should probably be willing as a society to pay. If it were up to me, people wouldn't spend their money on this, but people shouldn't generally listen to me about how to spend their money. So they shouldn't listen to me in this case either.
Well, I think you bring up a lot of important points, and I think it probably fit with a majority of where people stand with a lot of these services as well, too. I think when it comes to the selling of psychic services, though, I mean, what would you consider like something that you've looked into when it comes to a psychic service that would be the majority of things? Not necromancy, I don't see really being a majority, but like tarot card stuff like that. Do you see that being most common sold services, or do you see things like I don't really know a whole lot about the different types of psychic services out there.
I'm not sure what the most commonly sold psychic service is. There is an industry group, that studies the psychic industry. I think I think it, as far as I can tell, it's about
It's
2 billion in revenue.
parapsychology, isn't it?
Well, that's like the academic study of it. I'm thinking about there's a group that studies it as a business, and they've produced a yearly report about how much the industry as a whole grosses. I don't actually have access to that report at the moment, and I don't know what the most common psychic service is. I can tell you what I see most commonly, are probably cardomancers. Those are card readers, including tarot card, and I also see spiritual mediums, whereas that might involve necromancy, speaking with dead, but it just might involve more. It might not involve only speaking with dead people, but the spirit realm more generally, whether living or dead. So I don't. So the short answer to your question is I don't know what's the most common psychic service. I can simply guess based on what I see, which I think is
Yeah.
card reading and mediumship.
Do you think that there should be an oversight committee when it comes to something like this? Like, do you think that would be a good policy that have an actual established group of individuals that are working to be able to look through all these psychic things and trying to decipher if this is just someone having fun and trying to scam people, or someone that's actually doing this because they believe it, but also not charging? Because if it's not charging, I don't see the problem in them doing the actual service. But that's also kind of counterintuitive, I guess, because then you have the same thing where aren't you influencing people's thoughts and the way that they think about these types of things? And if you're really trying to get the whole world on the same page, which is never going to happen, but if there's like everyone trying to get to a reasonable conclusion about this is how the world works, water is called H2O, all this type of stuff, you have people that are getting inspirational beliefs or something that's kind of like a come to God moment when it's really being shown something that blows their mind. And next thing you know, that's their belief, and they start telling other people, and then it eventually feeds into this long chain of disconnect that we have in society today.
So I do think if psychic services were prohibited from being sold, you'd find a lot fewer psychics. Though you'd really have to enforce it, even in places where it's illegal to sell psychic services. Still, people sell a lot of psychic services. It's just that the government doesn't bother with it because they have better things to do. And maybe that's right, or maybe it contributes to a general lack of respect for the law. So So whether or not there should be, the sale of psychic services. So I'm really, as a business ethicist, I'm focusing on this buying and selling of goods and services. And so I do think it's not good when these things are sold. It's a kind of harm. People aren't getting what they pay for, and that's a bad thing. Usually in markets, we want people to get what they pay for. That's a positive value, and market should create value for people.
But an ethics committee.
Yeah. So I think the other, whether there should be an ethics committee, the question is, well, what authority would it have, and how would it operate? I think.
Jail time if they're giving wrong fortunes out there. Some people are really doing some dangerous stuff with it.
Yes, I think when we get to, I think it's bad when people tell people things that are false and cause other people to have false beliefs and make choices in their life based on bad information. I think that's bad, whether or not it involves the sale of a good or service. So if people they're bullshitting, or they're lying, or they're deceiving, or they're taking advantage of ignorance to direct people in a way that they want them to be directed without regard to what's best for that person. That's a problem, whether or not it involves a sale. That is a perfectly general problem, though, and it happens all the time. It happens in personal relationships. It happens in the public square with our politicians. It happens on the world stage. I don't think this is something that, we do regulate speech, but I think in general, most liberal democracies have decided that like the cure is going to be worse than the disease. Yes, it's bad if people tell people false beliefs and bullshit, take advantage of ignorance, and otherwise, try to get people to do things that are not in their interest, but trying to fix that problem by creating restrictions on speech is going to end up being worse than just allowing people to do all that stuff. And I think maybe the same thing would be true of psychic services. I think psychics may prey on vulnerable people in a way that, politicians and intimate partners don't, at least not in the same way. But the cure for the problems of free speech is probably going to be worse than the problems of free speech itself. At least that seems to be what we've decided as a society. We should let people say what they want, even if it's lying, at least in some cases, right? Not, in a commercial setting, or not, in a courthouse. But in a lot of cases, we just let that rip because we think, trying to enforce speech codes and regulations and laws is going to end up being worse.
Do you think a lot of it could be impacted by the fact that when someone does get duped by someone who's selling a psychic service, that they just don't want to seem like they were an idiot and duped, so they kind of double down and support a lot of what the person might have sold them in the first place as being beneficial to them?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that. So I think people have this, psychologists have a word for it. I don't have it ready to hand, but the preservation of a positive self-concept is very important to people. So if in the back of your mind, you might be thinking, I just got swindled, I just got duped, and only an idiot would have let that happen to them. But I'm not an idiot. So obviously I didn't get duped. Obviously I didn't get swindled. And it must be the case that that person is telling me the truth. And maybe I'm one of, to turn this on its head, just a select few who can see that. So it's not that I'm kind of this loser that's been duped. I'm actually one of the select few who can see the truth to what's going on, and the rest of the folks can't. So I think there's a lot going on with that. I think, we all have an interest in maintaining a positive perception of ourselves. And insofar as we worry that we got duped, we might try to turn that on its head and say that, in fact, just the opposite has occurred. I also think, even if we recognize that we have been duped and we feel better about ourselves for that, and that may happen in some cases, that might never show up in a survey, even an anonymous one. And it certainly wouldn't show up in a police report, because I think people feel embarrassed, as you said, that they were. No one, especially if they say, well, geez, I shouldn't have let that happen to myself. And I don't really want to admit it, because then I need to relive it to the police officer and perhaps to members of my family and maybe some slice of the public at large when I admit to this. So I think we really don't know the extent to which people are being taken advantage of by psychics because people are reluctant to admit that they were taken advantage of.
Well, Jeff, I really appreciate the time you gave me to do my show and having this conversation with me about this. Is there a place where people can find any of your links if you have the social media accounts or if you just have your academic profile? I can link in the description. And also where people could just find if you have any other published papers, any journalistic sites that you're on.
Sure. So if you search Jeffrey Moriarty Bentley on the web, your favorite search engine, you will, in all likelihood, come up with my faculty page at Bentley University. You would also come up with my uh, professional page on Google Sites, and feel free to click around there. I have a page on, Google Scholar. If you went to Google Scholar and typed in Jeffrey Moriarty, you can see all my publications. Those are probably the three main stops, but generally I'm Googleable. My name is sufficiently unique that you could find me, and I welcome engagement. And this is something that I'm interested in. I don't claim to have all the answers, but I do want to feel like I'm part of a conversation, including with you, Rob, to shed some light on these difficult issues and surface some new facts and arguments and help people decide things for themselves.
I've been fortunate to create a good, very positive listening audience. Thanks. So I'm sure a lot of people actually really enjoy this. But I appreciate your time, Jeff. I want to make sure I link all your links in the description. And thanks everybody for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank. Stay tuned for next episode.